the way. The camels are coming, oh, oh, oh. The camels are coming, oh, oh, oh. The camels are coming, oh, oh, oh. The camels are coming to body of clever.
Hello from Castle Goring, from Mickey and from me. Today we are going to be covering a very British scandal, which, to those of you who don't know, has been the hit of the Christmas season, except for the Queen's speech, done by the BBC about my father-in-law and stepmother-in-law's divorce. The British preoccupation with the divorce is lasted for much of my life, and I'm 72, and the divorce started in 59 to 63. It lasted 4 years. And the Argyll family have the distinction, if distinction is the right word to use, to have produced the two longest, costliest and nastiest divorces, one in English legal history, the other in Scottish legal history, because we have two jurisdictions in Great Britain. My father-in-law's divorce from Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, was the Scottish one. The English one was his great uncle, Lord Colin Campbell, against his great aunt, Lady Colin Campbell, born Gertrude Blood. And that ran from 1883 to 1886. It was the largest scandal of its age. It far eclipsed the Oscar Wilde scandal, because their sister-in-law was Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter. So the royal connection, plus the ducal connection, and lords and ladies and multiple adultery partners, made for an absolute sensation, and my father-in-law replicated it, even down to citing 3 correspondents, adding a 4th when it looked as if things were going to go awry, except my father-in-law refined it, because he made it known that he could name 88 men, which was always ridiculous, because most of the men were gay. But he knew that Margaret was decent, and that she would never, at a time when homosexuality was illegal in Britain and homosexuals would go to prison, that she would never have unmasked any of the men that he was alleging she had committed adultery with, who were not straight. Well, a lot of people thought that the series, it was a 3-parter, that it started pretty slowly and it was slightly muddled, but that the story was so fantastic that it gripped you no matter what. Well, to an extent there is merit in that. The story is fantastic. There's no two ways about it. I mean, you couldn't have made it up. But it was very badly done. I mean, had they bothered to get in touch with me and Margaret's son Brian, we would have set them band to rights on things, and they would have got a better story. Of course, it wouldn't have had the BBC anti-upper class agenda, where basically if you're a member of the upper classes, they've somehow got to denigrate or defile you. It wouldn't have had that element, which a very British scandal certainly does, because Margaret does not come out of it smelling of roses. It's just that big Ian, my father-in-law, as opposed to little Ian, his son, who was sitting beside him at court every single day of the trial, incidentally. He came out of it smelling of the most awful stench possible, which was just. It was just. That was just. But they did Margaret a series of injustices. The first was very superficial. Claire Foy is a nice-looking woman. Margaret never had long hair in her life. Why does Claire Foy have long hair rolled up? And why is she wearing a French twist, which means you have long hair? Margaret's hair was always cut so that her earlobes showed, so her earrings would show. Small details like that. If you look behind, you will see a picture of Margaret and me with a friend of mine, taken at the England ball in 1976. You will see how striking and distinctive she was, and how distinctive her hairstyle was. Margaret only ever had 3 hairstyles in the whole of her life, and she was very proud of that. She was very precise and punctilious as a personality, austere even. And she once ticked me off because she said on the 3 previous occasions that she'd seen me, I had worn my hair in different styles. And she pointed out to me that neither she nor the Queen ever changed their hairstyle. She said the Queen had only had 2 hairstyles in her life, which up to that time was true, and she had only ever had 3, which was true. Her hairstyle was far chicer than the muddled nonsense that they had Claire Foy wearing. The clothes, she was very simple and pared back, and everything fitted exquisitely and was beautifully made by top couturiers, and in very ladylike colours. Some of those colour combinations were the BBC's idea of classy, along the lines of Meghan. Classy, I'm really classy. I'm so classy that I know how to spell class. K-L-A-S-S, class. Well, that may be their idea of classy, but I can tell you, it's certainly not a sophisticate's idea of what sophisticated people do. Margaret's demeanour, completely wrong. Margaret was very measured. When she used her hand, she always cupped it, the way I'm doing mine now. She never was elaborate. They have Margaret showing up at parties, making an exhibition of herself, attention-seeking, grabbing attention in her demeanour. Never, never, never. She was used to attention from the time she was a little girl, and certainly by the time she was a teenager. She was so used to attention, she never had to do anything. She'd walk into a room, her reputation, first of all for style and beauty, then latterly for style, beauty and notoriety, preceded her. I can tell you, when you're really well known and you walk into a room, especially if you have had a reputation for good looks and know how to present yourself in terms of attire, you don't need to do a thing to get attention. It comes to you. The Joan Collinses and the Meghan Markles of this world, who seek attention, may get it, and Joan Collins has merit, but it is not what you would call classy. It's just not classy. And no well-bred woman would walk the way Claire Foy walks in A Very British Scandal. She walks too much like Joan Collins or Meghan Markle, who are flaunting their wares and advertising their desirability. South of the border down Mexico way, I know that I'm a hot chick. No, very inelegant. And Margaret was supremely elegant. The series got several things dramatically wrong, I've got to tell you, and it was to the detriment of the story. The first thing they got really wrong was that Sarah Phelps claims that Margaret was slut-shamed, and that it's because she was a woman. Margaret wasn't slut-shamed because she was a woman. Margaret was a victim of blackmail by a duke who used her, shall we say, very untoward methods. But what Margaret had going against her was that she was perceived to be a rich American. She wasn't American. She was far more Scottish than Ian Argyll. Ian Argyll's mother was American and grandmother was American. Ian Argyll was three-quarter American. Margaret was a wholly Scottish-born woman. Her family was an older Scottish family than the Campbells. The Campbells came from Ireland about 1,000 years ago. Margaret's family were traceably Scottish from before that. These are things that people didn't realise, and certainly Lord Wheatley, the judge, who was insuperably snobbish, as only an arriviste can be, he thought a duke can't possibly be lying. Oh no. And this horrid American woman. It was xenophobia and class prejudice that got Margaret, not because she was a woman. Let's get that square. There are no two ways around it. My father-in-law was a nasty piece of work. My sister-in-law Jeannie, when I married her brother, and remember, to those of you who don't know, Jeannie was my friend first. I was staying with Jeannie when I met her brother. Jeannie's the one who promoted the match, and Jeannie's the one who arranged the marriage. Jeannie made all the arrangements and talked me out of any reservations I had. And I'm not decrying her for doing any of that. I thought Jeannie was a really lovely person. And incidentally, in the show, they call her Jeanne. Nobody called her Jeanne except my pretentious brother-in-law, who called her Jeanne. Everybody else called her Jeannie. Jeannie. They have a scene where my father-in-law is as he's sneaking into Margaret's house at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street, which incidentally was not a flat, it was a house. He's calling her Jeanne. And of course they show 48 Upper Grosvenor Street, which had a very famous drawing room by Ciri Maugham. Ciri Maugham was the wife of a famous writer, and she was the decorator of her day, along with Elsie de Wolfe, who was latterly Lady Mendel. And Ciri Maugham's drawing rooms were famous for being white on white, not the shock of colours all darkened incidentally, that they have in the BBC show. I mean, they got absolutely nothing stylistically right. It's just amazing that they could have got everything so wrong. It's their version of elegance and style. It's the difference between Cristobal Balenciaga or Norman Norell, with everything impeccably fitted, super glamorous, and, shall we say, Target elegance, to those of you who know what Target is. Very déclassé. The main thing that they got wrong was to blame Margaret for the bastardy case, and to say that Margaret is the person who forged Wee Wee's handwriting and sent a note to Big Ian claiming that his two sons with Wee Wee, who was his second wife, were illegitimate. That is completely untrue, and I first heard about the bastarding case from Jeannie. After I married Colin, she thought I needed to know a few pertinent facts about what had gone on in their family. You can come up back. You can come up. Come on. No, you can come up. Come on. Yeah, come. Mickey wanted to come back up. And she told me about the bastardy case, which to her was her father at his absolute worst. She told it to me in connection with her bitter regrets at what he had involved her with in the divorce against Margaret, because he had convinced Jeannie to accompany him to 48 Upper Grosvenor Street at a time that Margaret and Big Ian were separated and the divorce was trundling through the courts. And while Big Ian held Margaret down, she rifled through Margaret's dressing table and stole her diary. And she bitterly regretted it. And she and Margaret ended up on very good terms. And she told me that her father had concocted the whole thing. He had taken it into his head, whether fairly or unfairly, I have to tell you, is a moot question, because the truth was not something that concerned him greatly when his pocket was involved. He had married two women for money, Jeannie's mother Janet Aitken, who was Lord Beaverbrook's daughter. He ran through every farthing Janet had, and then decamped with Wee Wee, who was wife number 2, but let's stick to wife number 1, Janet. And I heard this incidentally from Janet herself. I knew 3 of the 4 wives. I knew Janet, I knew Margaret, and I knew Matilda. The only one I didn't know was my true mother-in-law, Wee Wee, who died 2 years before I met her son. And their father died the year before I met his son. So I didn't know either of my parents-in-law, but I certainly knew an awful lot about them gratis Jeannie, because Jeannie had become a Catholic and a devout Catholic, and she was horrified as to some of the things that her father had convinced her to do. And Erica Freeman, who was a great friend of hers, once said to me, she said, you know, Georgie, it's really important that you understand that you married a true sociopath, and you need to look up and research sociopathy, because according to Jeannie, both her brothers and her father were true sociopaths. And until you research it and know what you're dealing with, you really will have no idea of what you're dealing with. And she was absolutely right. Well, Jeannie told me that her father concocted the whole thing because Margaret's father had turned off the money tap. And incidentally, in the TV series, Margaret's father has a very regional, in other words, arriviste or working class made good accent. The Wiggams were a very, very respectable family, members of the upper class, untitled. He did not have a regional accent. He sounded like the gentleman he was in terms of rank. I just make that point for what it's worth, because they have portrayed him as being a working class boy made good. And he certainly made good, but he didn't start out as a working class boy. He ended up as one of the richest men in the world. Well, he turned off the money tap. After his daughter and my father-in-law had been married for a few years, and he knew that Margaret was being knocked around by Big Ian, and that Big Ian had a huge drinking problem and a huge problem with drugs. He was addicted to Purple Hearts, and that Margaret was trying to wean him off drink and drugs. Has to be said, a problem I had, for what that's worth. Because some things run in families. And George Wiggam turned off the money tap. And Big Ian came up with a scheme to assure himself of inheriting Wiggam money. Because George Wiggam was older and not in great health. And the scheme was that Big Ian would delegitimize his two sons, and he and Margaret would get a baby from Poland, who would become the next Duke of Argyll. And he, Big Ian, would therefore be assured of having Wiggam money. Maybe not sooner, but definitely once George Wiggam's grandson was going to be the 12th Duke of Argyll, and once he was born Marquis of Lorne. Quite Machiavellian, I would have said. Well, Wee got wind of this. And incidentally, in this TV series, they've got the dates, the places, all completely wrong. They have a scene where when the legitimacy of the children has become an issue, that Big Ian goes and sees Wee in Biarritz. Well, and she denies that she was ever unfaithful to him, and he believes her. Well, I don't remember who Little Ian's father was supposed to be, but he was untitled. But Wee was having an affair before the Second World War, when they were living in Portugal. And according to Big Ian, Little Ian was the product of that romance. And Margaret made the valid point to me, incidentally, that she had no knowledge of when Big Ian and Wee slept together. So it's hardly plausible that she would have been able to be planting things in his mind about the legitimacy of the children when he knew when he slept with her and when he didn't. After the war, and Wee Wee was wonderful during the war, evidently, because my father-in-law was a prisoner of war from 1940 to 1945. And we organised care packages and medical supplies and all different sorts of things from Portugal. I mean, she was a powerhouse to make sure that not only her husband, but all of the other prisoners, that they could send them care packages. And she did. However, she was also in love with Prince Dimitri of Russia and wanted to marry him. And he would have at one point married her. But then he fell in love with Lady Millbank, who was the former Sheila Loughborough. She'd been Lady Loughborough, who had an affair with, wait for it, King George VI when he was Duke of York. And King George V broke up the relationship and said to him, if you give up Lady Loughborough, I'll make you Duke of York. But you have to give up Lady Loughborough. And he did. And he got his dukedom. Oh, and incidentally, about dukedoms and duchies. In the TV show, they say that something about the Duchy of Argyll. Sorry, dukes inherit dukedoms. Duchies are states that are ruled by dukes. So they don't even get that right. And they certainly didn't get the grammar right, because, for instance, they had my father-in-law speaking about between you and I. Well, no well-spoken person refers to between you and I. It's between you and me. And certainly anybody who learnt Latin would know a small detail like that, but clearly at the BBC they don't know about things like that. But anyway, to go back to the point I was making, which is about the bastardy matter. Big Ian came up with this plan and got Margaret to ask a friend of hers, Diana Tauber. She was the widow of Richard Tauber. Richard Tauber was a famous tenor of light operettas and light opera and operettas, to be actually accurate. I'm scrambling things because I'm tired, if the truth be known. I've had such an exhausting time of it, but wonderful nevertheless. And in the series, they do have a scene with Margaret and Diana Tauber, which is pretty accurate, where Margaret asks Diana Tauber to go to Poland or arrange through Poland to get a baby boy. Well, Wee Wee got wind of this, and Wee Wee was outraged, hopped on a plane, came over here, all fired up to take Big Ian to court. And he said to Margaret, and this I know from Margaret, but I also know it from Jeannie, so I know it's true. He said to Margaret, if you will take the rap for me, everything will be fine. I will give up drinking, I will give up Purple Hearts, we'll have a good marriage the way we used to in the early days. Everything will be fine. It will be like it was the first year we were together, when he was really auditioning for the role of husband, or as he told her the day before the marriage, which was the only time he showed his true colours, until the wedding ring was on her finger, when he ticked her off and was nasty and insulting, told her her children were spoiled brats, and that when the wedding ring was on her finger, he would be in the driving seat and she thought it was an aberration. But it wasn't. She was seeing the true man. Anyway, to resume the thread. Sorry, I'm meandering, but I need to get in the points as they occur to me. She accepted the deal. She took the rap. You talk about folly. She took the rap. On his behalf. Wiwi goes back to America because she was living in America. Wiwi had not been living in Biarritz. That invented scene of Big Ian and Wiwi where she says she's never been unfaithful, complete nonsense. They had what's now called an open marriage, and he knew that she'd been in love with Dimitri of Russia and wanted to marry Dimitri, and indeed he used to say that Dimitri of Russia was Colin's father. I didn't believe it, I've got to tell you. I thought it was just the ravings of a drunken lunatic, until I met Prince Nikita of Russia. And when I met him, the facial configuration was almost identical. 8 inches or so difference in height, but virtually identical facial configuration. And at that point I thought, oh, well, maybe there's something to it. But who knows? Because it's very, very unadvised to actually believe the word of a drunkard who's cross-addicted to drugs and who's desperate for money. But to cut a long story short, once we went back to America, Big Ian said to Margaret, I want a divorce. And she said along the lines of, but everything's fine now. He said, no, I'm not giving up drinking. I'm not giving up anything. I want a divorce and I want £250,000. And at this point, I need to digress slightly. I am the only person who has ever publicly stated that the figure involved was £250,000. I got it from Margaret, and when I was doorstepped by the press at Farm Street Catholic Church the day of her funeral, and the press shoved microphones practically down my throat, I was so annoyed I came right out with it and said exactly what had happened. Sarah Phelps doesn't give me credit for having said it, doesn't place this conversation where it belongs, which is at the beginning of the divorce. She places it in an imaginary scene towards the end of the divorce. That's complete rubbish. She is nailing him, but also nailing Margaret. And Margaret doesn't deserve to be nailed. She didn't deserve to be nailed by Lord Wheatley because she wasn't a rich American, and she doesn't deserve to be nailed by Sarah Phelps, who's trying to, at the very moment that she is denigrating Margaret and the aristocracy, she is pretending that she is boosting Margaret as some sort of feminist who was ahead of her time. Margaret wasn't ahead of her time. She was absolutely a creature of her time. There was no way she was anything but the archetypal woman of her time. And it's a very poor excuse to denigrate Margaret the way she did and use pretend nonsense about misogyny. It had nothing to do with misogyny. Anyway, to resume what I was saying, I will pick up back the thread, if I may. Margaret refused to pay him £250,000. He said, according to her, "Two women have divorced me, and I'm not allowing a third to do it unless I walk with a lot of money," because he hadn't walked with any money from Wee Wee or from Janet, because he'd run through all their disposable assets. But he also knew that Margaret's father had money and that she would be his heir. So he thought he could threaten, and that Margaret would run to Daddy and Daddy would pay to get rid of him. But Margaret refused to run to Daddy. Margaret said to him, "No, I'm not giving you another penny. You've gone back on your word," or words to this effect. This was a thrust of what she told me, she said. "No, I'm not giving you a penny, and you can't divorce me. You have no grounds." He said, "We'll see," or words to that effect, and concocted grounds. Big Ian knew that Margaret was very sociable, and she was out on the town an awful lot with what nowadays people would disparagingly, I'd hate the expression, by the way, call walkers, usually gay men. In all the years I knew Margaret, I never saw her being walked by anybody who was of the marrying kind, if you get my drift. She refused to succumb to blackmail, and this was at the very beginning of the case, incidentally. He concocted evidence. He, in the series A Very British Scandal, pays a locksmith to break into her desk and to get her diaries and her appointment books, and according to them comes across note paper that proves that she concocted the letter that was sent anonymously to him about Wee Wee, except Jeanie said he was responsible. Jeanie wouldn't lie. I then asked Margaret about it after I met her, and she was terrified to speak about it because she was under a penal notice. And I pointed out to her, "Margaret, Jeanie's told me everything. There's no way I'm telling anybody. So, there's nothing to fear. You're never going to go to prison. I'm not stupid. I'm not going to be, going around chatting about this," and didn't. Anyway, he set Margaret up. He concocted the evidence using as his precedent 1883 to 1886 divorce of his great uncle and great aunt. 3 correspondents, a 4th correspondent added at the 99th hour to drive through divorce, except he had a refinement. In the 1880s, their sister-in-law had been Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter. So, because of the royal connection, it was the greatest scandal of the Victorian age, far bigger than the Oscar Wilde scandal. But nobody remembered it. Margaret didn't even know about it. Margaret didn't even know about the 1883 to 1886 divorce of Lord and Lady Colin Campbell. I'm the one who had to tell her about it. She was gobsmacked to discover that Big Ian had a precedent and had faithfully adhered to it with embellishments like the 88 lovers, because you see, he needed to replicate the sensationalism that the royal connection in the 1880s had assured of publicity, because he and little Ian set about selling stories to the newspapers with Jeannie's help. Jeannie's grandfather was Lord Beaverbrook. Jeannie herself was a well-known journalist. Jeannie had even been engaged to Henry Luce, who owned Time Life. I mean, these are the caliber of people that Margaret was up against. And Big Ian understood that he could make money selling stories about his divorce and about Margaret to the newspapers, and proceeded to do so. That's how he was going to make money, and did. It wasn't as good as getting George Wigham's money, but he then started to have an affair with Jane Wigham, George Wigham's second wife. Because after Margaret's mother died, he married the woman he'd been having an affair with. She was much younger than his first wife. She was Margaret's age. And I doubt very much that Jane Wigham ever loved George Wigham. I think she married him for his money, and certainly she started an affair with my father-in-law. Margaret knew it but couldn't prove it, unfortunately. Pity that she couldn't prove it. Jeannie knew about it, but Jeannie was in those days on the other side of the fence. And it was only after the divorce that Margaret was able to prove that Big Ian and her stepmother were having an affair. Because Big Ian had figured out that the sensible thing to do was, since he didn't want to give up drinking, didn't want to give up drugs, and didn't want to give up George Wigham's money, he would simply marry his widow, because George Wigham was ill and dying. And in those days, divorces weren't snapped the way they are nowadays. If you were dying and you were separated, which they were, the Wighams, the wife inherited a widow's portion, and Big Ian and Jane Wigham both knew that as long as she remained George Wigham's lawful wife, she would have to inherit the dowager's rights to all of the money that was in his name in the Bahamas, and we're speaking about a lot of money. Well, Margaret figured that one out. She used to say, "Oh, sweetie," and incidentally, she never stammered like that, the way they unattractively have her stammering. She only ever hesitated slightly, and it was actually quite charming, and she always hesitated over sweetie. I don't know if it was the S or the W, but she called me sweetie, and she always hesitated slightly. And she used to say, "Oh, sweetie, I was a dumb bunny, and you prevailed because you're so much more intelligent than I am." Well, she wasn't so dumb, let me tell you, that she didn't figure out what her husband and stepmother were up to, and she fought tooth and nail to make sure that Jane didn't get a hold of her father's money so easily, because Margaret knew that if Big Ian couldn't get a hold of her father's money, he would lose interest in Jane and wouldn't marry her. And that's exactly what happened. She tied Jane up in litigation long enough to prevent the marriage. Otherwise, her stepmother would have been the next Duchess of Argyll. In fact, the next Duchess of Argyll was Matilda Mortimer Heller. Matilda was lovely. I have to say, I really loved Matilda. She was a blue stocking. She was not a very good-looking woman, but she was attractive. But she was really very interesting, intelligent. She was, one of her greatest friends was Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist. There's a story there too, which is truly unbelievable, except it happened. When Big Ian was 22, he had an affair with Tilly Coster, who was Matilda's mother. Tilly Coster Mortimer. She was Mrs. Stanley Mortimer. And she got pregnant while they were having the affair. And the baby was duly born, Matilda. Stanley Mortimer never ever saw the child, wasn't in the same room, never received the child, had nothing to do with her. On the presumption of legitimacy, she was a Mortimer, but he wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with her and didn't. And he and everybody else in their circle believed that Matilda was Ian Campbell, as he then was, Ian Campbell's daughter. And incidentally, while it occurs to me, I'm sorry to keep on interjecting, Margaret was not Margaret Campbell, the Duchess of Argyll. She was Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. Duchesses take as their surname the title of their husband. They do not assume their husband's surname. So he was Ian Campbell, 11th Duke of Argyll, and she was Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. So anyway, this is long before he becomes Duke of Argyll, because he succeeded to the title as a result of there being no other heirs from his first cousin once removed. But again, in the TV series, they make it out that he might not have succeeded to the title. Everybody always knew he was going to succeed to the title. There were no other heirs. So that again is another load of rubbish. But to pick up back my thread, I'm meandering. But if I don't meander, it's going to be too much like a lecture and too dull and boring. Fast forward, Matilda and Big Ian meet. And he's having an affair with Jane Wigham. He starts an affair with Matilda. He used to call Matilda the Bet. And I don't know what Matilda knew and didn't know, and what she believed and didn't believe, because I never discussed it with her. She was a lovely woman, and I certainly was not going to discuss something so sensitive with her. But I would stake my life on it that she never, ever thought, it never crossed her mind that she might have married her father. Because the story was that she, according to Big Ian, and he used to laugh about it, And when he wasn't saying, ha ha ha, I might have married my daughter, he would say, I married my bet. I married not my bet, he'd say, I married the bet. He called Matilda the bet. While he was having an affair with Tilly Mortimer, he bet her that she wouldn't be able to get a friend of theirs called Stephen Parrott, who was a confirmed bachelor, into bed. Now, in those days, before television and all of the tremendous activities that we have nowadays to distract us, people had to create their own entertainment. And it has to be said that the sexual allure of good-looking women was highly rated as a form of entertainment. And it has to be said, he also had a large connection of pornography, so he obviously liked louche things. He bet Tilly Mortimer that she wouldn't be able to get Stephen Parrott into bed, and she did on one occasion only. 9 months later, Matilda was born, and Matilda believed that Stephen Parrott was her father. However, Big Ian was sleeping with Tilly Mortimer before, during, and after. So, short of doing DNA, there's no certainty who Matilda's father was. And Big Ian certainly knew that the possibility existed that he was Matilda's father. This again is something I learned from Jeannie. I have to say, because I was married into the family, I wasn't going to be judgmental, but I did think, my goodness, what an extraordinary situation. Well, that of course doesn't feature at all in a very British scandal, because either they didn't know or they didn't care. What they should have known, and I find unforgivable that they didn't know, was the full extent of how Margaret was set up. And the reason why they didn't know was they did not try to get in touch with either Brian or me. I know this to be a fact because Brian and I were close friends. We were on the phone to each other very often. He used to come and stay here. Had he not died, he would have come back and stayed here. He was often here. And of course, we spoke about family matters. Had they cared enough to not just run riot with aren't all of the aristocracy decadent, they would have realized how completely victimized Margaret had been by my father-in-law. And I think it is unforgivable that they now have in the record a version of the facts that bear little resemblance to the truth. They had the facts, they could have got to the truth. They only needed to ask me or Brian, and they didn't want to have their narrative polluted with our facts. They didn't want to see the light. They wanted to shine their light into dark corners, and to do it in such a way that Margaret was trashed as well as Big Ian. He was simply trashed more than she was. I will say, I found watching the series extremely distressing. because I know the suffering that Margaret endured as a result of being caught up in the grips of a money-grubbing sociopath. It also was far too resonant of my own experience to be anything but comforting. I will end on a positive note, though, by making the point that the cycle of depravity has finally been broken, and I knew it would be broken, even when we were all young, because the present Dowager Duchess of Argyll, the former Iona Cahoon, is a decent person. And even while I was married to Colin, and even as our divorce was trundling along, it has to be said, with her husband Ian trying to, with Colin's connivance, to exploit me financially and to use my upbringing to try to create the third of the great Argyll sensational divorces, which they didn't succeed in doing. That I and Iona, we've never had a crossword. I saw the way she was bringing up Torquil. Louise was just a baby. I ran across her once or twice thereafter. We've always had cordial relations, and I knew that Iona was a good woman and that she had her feet firmly planted on the ground, and she wasn't crazy like the rest of them. And that if those children had her input, the cycle of depravity and dreadful marriages would finally be broken. And it has been broken, because both the present Duke and his sister, I know from people who know them well, are lovely, decent people with good marriages. They owe that entirely to their mother. And isn't it wonderful that after hundreds of years of disastrous marriages, that one good woman could change the course of history? And on that note, I will say thank you very much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this. If you have, please like, share, subscribe, press the notification bell, and please keep the questions coming in. Remember, this can't be done without you. God bless and goodbye.